Does buying a home still make sense in the UK in 2021? That is the question we will be attempting to answer today. And you'll be well aware that there's been some explosive growth in house prices up and down the country over the last year off the back of a very strong decade as a whole. House prices are growing faster than salaries, meaning that houses are becoming less affordable as time goes on. So does buying a home still make sense, or is renting actually the optimal solution? So welcome back to the channel, and I'm Jake, a third year economics student, and I decided to put the camera a bit further away today because I do look quite rough, and there is a reason for that. I've currently got COVID, so I had a bit of a rough week, but I will be uploading a bit more consistently once again now I can breathe properly. But to answer today's question, for some people it's an absolute categorical yes. They want somewhere that they can call their own and somewhere that is able to produce a capital gain above the rate of inflation, therefore making them wealthier over time. And yet many believe that buying a house is a horribly inefficient use of their money, with the belief that having a lot of money tied up in an asset that doesn't produce a cash flow is an absolute disaster, and there are better gains to be had elsewhere. And that certainly has been true of the last 120 years. Since 1900, the global property market's annual return is 3.9%, whereas global stocks have achieved a rate above that at 6.9%. But that is the past, and it's not quite as black and white as that, and it starts to get a bit more interesting when we start introducing mortgages, as we will see a bit later on in this video. But that is the basic premise of the debate between ownership and renting. Rather than saving towards a deposit and paying down a mortgage with interest, it's better to invest the deposit money plus what you save as a tenant rather than owning into the stock market, potentially achieving a greater rate of return than your property purchase would. And it may also surprise you that the UK property market didn't exceed this global average. It was right on par at the exact same growth of 3.9% annually since 1900. But before we start to play around with some numbers to see if this invest and don't buy mantra really lives up to what it claims, we have to bear in mind, as always, that there is never a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to finances. We all want and need different things, and the UK property market is very different depending on what region we look at, and we can't predict the future. So with that in mind, attempting to calculate the financially optimal solution in terms of renting or buying is probably going to be incorrect, and secondly, not necessarily the right thing to do for you. If the financially optimal course of action makes you miserable, then what's the point? And I don't think that gets mentioned enough in personal finance videos. It's not always about the numbers. So firstly, I do want to take a look at the non-financial differences between being a homeowner and a tenant, because they are just as, if not more important than the financial implications of whatever decision you go for. So some of the advantages of buying a home and disadvantages of renting. So your monthly repayments will go towards buying your home, not into a landlord's pocket, and psychologically I think that is quite an important factor for many people. So once the mortgage is paid off, you fully own your home at the end of the mortgage term, meaning in retirement you're going to have fewer outgoings and a reassurance that you'll always have somewhere to live rather than paying rent for your entire life, even after you retire. And you don't need anyone's permission to do anything if it's your home, to have pets or redecorate, whatever it is. You can really make it your home, and any maintenance or changes you make to your house could increase its value. And you can't be forced to move by a landlord, which is important, because if you say you've just started a family, the last thing you want to be doing is looking for somewhere to live. So owning provides the stability renting can't. If your landlord decides to sell or get new tenants, you might have to move out, and there's nothing you can do about it. But what are the disadvantages of buying a home? So buying a home will initially be more expensive than renting. There are upfront costs like mortgage fees, stamp duty that you will need to budget for, and I've mentioned previously in a video. These are upfront fees when buying a home, so if you want to move around a lot, renting might be a better option. So you're locked into a location much more so than if you were renting. But that also depends on the length of your tenancy when renting. And it can be complicated. I'm sure you know there's lots going on with mortgages, remortgaging, interest rates. It's a complex process, much more so than renting, which can be a bit of a drain on you and your time. And interest rate rises can increase your monthly payments, although you can get fixed rates for say 2 or 5 years. And as a homeowner, you will have to pay for repairs, including if it's urgent like a leak or a boiler breakage, and if you fall too far behind on your mortgage payments, you could face bankruptcy and face your house being repossessed. So likewise, if property values fall, you will lose money, and renting doesn't have that risk. You don't have that exposure to the property market and its prices. So that was a very broad overview of all the pros and cons that surround the ownership versus renting debate. But now let's dive a bit deeper into the actual numbers. So first, I just want to use this very simple rent versus buy calculator, and this misses and simplifies a lot of things, but it's a useful starting point. So all the numbers I'm putting in are going to be the most sort of up-to-date averages and reasonable assumptions to show you what the end result is. But I'll leave a link to this tool so you can play around with the different numbers and have a go at something that's more representative of your situation and what you'll be looking at. So the median rent in the UK last year was £700, which I was actually very surprised at, as I was literally paying £600 for a room in student halls, but that's Brighton for you. And the average property price is roughly £261,000 as of July in 2021 in England. It's a starter home, so I'm only going to be staying there for 10 years, but the longer I stay there, the more upfront costs are spread out. So taking out a 25-year mortgage with a 15% deposit and a 2.5% interest rate. And this is the biggest simplification here and the largest unknown. In reality, this could come down potentially all the way down to under 1% if I remortgage in the future with a lower loan to value mortgage, but it could also rise far higher if we see interest rates rise in the future. So if we say on average I'm paying 2.5%, which is probably a bit high given the current situation, but it's reasonable enough to assume over the duration. Then we have to make further assumptions. So let's say inflation is a bit higher than it has been over the last 20 years. It's going to say on average 3%, so rents are rising at inflation at 3% per year. And a 7% investment return in the global index, which is about average going back to 1900, but of course that's not a guarantee in the future. And note that these are nominal returns and not real returns after inflation, but let's discount that for a minute. So as we saw earlier, I'd pay £995 towards my mortgage each month, but if I choose to rent, I'll only have £700 coming out each month, meaning that I can invest this difference into an index fund, which when averaging 7% per year in 10 years time will mean I'll have a balance of £51,000. So there's no stamp duty because I'm a first time buyer, so I'm exempt on anything under £300,000, so let's say £5,000 in other fees, which might be a bit high, and a further 2% to cover maintenance and repairs of my property that I wouldn't incur when I'm renting. And after that short time frame of 10 years, given those numbers, I'd be far better off financially owning the property if I lived in the property even longer, then that benefit would be even greater. Now that is not a definitive answer, of course. Even though I was probably a bit biased towards renting, the homeowner still came out on top financially in this basic calculator. We can't say for sure which is going to be better, but it's still quite a strong result, and I'll explain why this is the case in just a minute, despite the stock market performing better. There is another similar spreadsheet with more variable inputs that was made by Hayden, and I'll leave a link to that in the description, but I won't go into another example, but you can have a play around with that as well. But there is a slight problem with this, because according to the Halifax Buying versus Renting report, first-time buyers in every region of the UK have a lower monthly mortgage repayment than the average rental payment of a 3-bed home, with an average saving of over £800 a year. And that saving is actually greatest where property prices are the most expensive, and this is all because of the strange times that we're living in with how cheap mortgages are. Now, just one type of property, but you can see renters may not be able to save much more than if they were homeowners. So we'll be unable to benefit from that saving and investing approach if this is the case. And the reason for the big difference here, despite the stronger growth in equity, is because of the access to a mortgage. So let's say a 20% deposit on a 250k property. By putting down 20% of the money and borrowing the rest, the buyer is using a 80% mortgage, which is a form of leverage. So assuming the property appreciates at a rate of 5% per year, so the property goes to 267,000 in a year's time, meaning a gain of 12.5k. But had they not purchased the property, so purchase £50,000 worth of index funds, for example, with their deposit money, the buyer's gain would be just 2.5k over the course of 12 months versus the 12.5k on the home, despite the same percentage gain in each asset class. And that 10k difference demonstrates the potential of leverage, aka the mortgage that the buyer used. Now picture that 5% gain every year over 20 years. And over time, the use of leverage can have a significant and very positive impact on your net worth if property prices keep rising. And that is why the home buyer comes out on top on most occasions when using this basic calculator, because of the leverage and the mortgage he's had access to. So yes, you're going to have to be paying an interest rate on your mortgage, but the longer you're paying back, the less goes towards interest and the more goes to paying the capital amount back, and the cheaper it gets. So an example here, let's say you take out a mortgage for 200k at 2% on that example property we just saw. Therefore, the first year you'll pay approximately £4,000 in interest rate repayments. In reality, it's going to be a little bit less than that, because every monthly payment will reduce the outstanding mortgage. But let's simplify it at 4,000. So say your monthly mortgage repayment is roughly £600 a month. That's £7,200 per year. So out of the £7,200, 4,000 goes to interest and only 3,200 goes towards capital repayment and bringing your mortgage balance down. But every year you're doing that, as your outstanding mortgage is coming down, so does the interest on that. So more of your mortgage repayment goes towards capital repayment, and generally by year about 3 or 4 you should be on to over 50% going towards capital repayment. And of course that massively is dependent on your mortgage rate and the term you choose, but for first time buyers who have had less time to build up equity in the home, they're at more risk when it comes to interest rate rises, because more is going to be going towards interest. Now that's a huge simplification, but it should help you understand the basic principle and the point about mortgages and interest rate changes. And the people at the start of their mortgage term with greater debt, aka first time buyers, are much more vulnerable to interest rate rises. Whether rates will rise again is of course an unknown at the moment. Another thing you may have seen in personal finance folklore is called the rule of 5%, which is a very simple evaluation tool, and it goes as follows. So the rule of 5% comes from an estimation of the 3 costs that homeowners face that renters don't face. So property taxes of 1%, maintenance costs of 1%, and a thing called the cost of capital at 3%. Now obviously that's a bit American, but property tax is the US equivalent of council tax, but here in the UK the renter is liable for that. So we can actually discount this, as homeowners and renters are both liable. They both face the same cost in terms of council tax. And maintenance costs of 1% of the property value to keep the property in a livable condition is not something the renter has to do. So this is an additional cost for the homeowner, and in my opinion is actually slightly low. UK properties tend to be a bit older than elsewhere, so more work's needed, so I'll bump this up to 2%. And then the cost of capital is made up of 2 things. So the literal cost of the mortgage, so that is the interest rate, which in the rule of 5% is estimated to be about 3%, which is a bit high due to the currently low mortgage rates that we're seeing. But if you're using a 5% deposit, this 3% interest rate might actually be fairly close to reality. And then the second thing is made up of the opportunity cost of the money you have tied up in the deposit, and the opportunity cost is simply the difference between the rate at which your money is growing in your home versus the index funds we've previously talked about. And using the global average of 3.9%, the difference is 3%, so that makes up the additional 3% we need for the rule of 5%. So to bring it all together, you simply multiply the value of your potential home by 5%, divide that number by 12, and the result is something called the break-even point, where renting is financially equivalent to buying. So if you can rent a similar property for less than that break-even number, then you're better off renting, and vice versa, according to this rule. And whether this is true or accurate is up for debate, and it's obviously dependent on what happens with mortgage rates and the type of property you're going to be wanting to live in. So after all those different methods of looking, essentially we don't really know, and that is always the case with these things. Trying to predict what's going to happen over a long period of time in a complicated environment with lots of intermingling parts is a very hard task. So it's often non-financial elements which dominate the decision-making process. You can't put a price on not having the stress of dealing with a crap landlord. And as Morgan Housel, the author of Psychology of Money, the Bible of sensible personal finance said people don't always want to maximise financial return, they want to maximise for how well they sleep at night. And I don't know how you're sleeping at night knowing that you're not subscribed to the channel or having watched this far and still not pressed the like button, but thanks for watching and I will see you all next time.